There we go. Hello. Welcome to tonight's live chat. We're going to be talking about the very simple and specific topic of how to write a book. We're not sure if we're going to have enough to talk about in this topic. So just to kind of get us started off talking about this, I wanted to kind of go through the whole process from beginning to end of writing a book. But I also wanted to avoid the really general question of where do your ideas come from? Because we can all agree that that changes every time and it's not a very specific or easy to answer question as a writer. So instead, I've asked everybody to share an experience of how you got one of your book ideas. So what were you doing at the time? Did something specific inspire it? What form did it take? Was it just an image or a sentence or a concept? And what did you do with that idea once you had it? So the first person I have is Desiree.
Okay. Well, I will talk about how I got my idea for the pirate novel I've been working on for a million years, and I'm really sick of it at this point, but I'll talk about it anyway. I actually had a very, very cliche writer moment, and I woke up out of a dead sleep in a cold sweat. Like I had a dream about a pirate society. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if pirates actually had their own monarchy system and ruled the world? And I woke up and had to write it down, and then I went back to sleep. But that's how I got the idea for that one.
It's always exciting. And then I have Erin.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Witches of Ash and Ruin book for most of this because that is what I was just in the thick of the edits for. So obviously it's not really on my mind. So for that one, it's almost always different. I don't have one specific thing that always happens to me with ideas. This one was a general feeling of wanting to see more of a certain aspect of the Raven Boys. I love that series. As everyone probably knows who watches this channel, we all love that series, or most of us do. I was downloading the audiobooks and was listening to the first one over again and realizing how much I love Blue's home environment and her house and all of the women that live there. And I was thinking to myself, well, they're essentially witches, even though it's never really, I think they address it once or twice, but it's not really that acknowledged, just that they have magic and they live in a big house full of these women. And I thought, we don't stay with them for as much as I'd like. I just want a book all about these women. And then, naturally the next step is well, why don't you write your own book then? So that's where that idea came from. So it's usually something I want to see more of.
And that book is coming out next year.
Add Wishes of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer on your Goodreads.
Yeah.
Whole subtle marketing pitch.
I got you.
Thanks, ladies.
And then I have Kelly.
So I went through of trying to figure out which one made the most sense, what was the most common thing. And again, like Emma said, there's no common one. There's no getting to it. So there's two different series that I did where I picked a genre that I really liked and built an idea from the ground up. So one was space opera and one was urban fantasy. So it was kind of, okay, what elements do I love about these genres? What parts do I want to explore? Which things do I think I can do a little differently? So instead of having a flash of an idea, it was more of okay, I want to write something in this. Where do I go from here? So it was a different experience than I've done the dream ones, which are always my most exciting ideas, but building it from the ground up was a learning experience, I think.
And those are Magic in My Bones and Into the Void by Kelly Sheridan, available on Amazon.
Well done.
Kelly, honestly, I have to say, that seems very terrifying to me. That idea of having the genre first, not even the idea or anything. So you're I mean, we already know that Kelly's a superstar, but that just verified it.
And honestly, they're my best selling ones, which is surprising. I did not expect that. So yeah.
Very cool.
That's cool. And then I have Rachel.
I have two bigger projects that I was working on. One of them, which is my fairy story, is mostly actually what Kelly says is I love that genre so much, really influenced by Holly Black and Amy Novik and like Catherine Valente. So like I want to write something with that type of feeling. So like in that case I did that. But then with the other more like Arabian Nights folklore one that I'm looking at, that was actually from scrolling on Pinterest and looking at art. Because I've gotten really into digital art and just kind of like falling down that rabbit hole. And so usually I'll find character designs first, and then I'm like, I want to know who that character is, and I'll build someone, and from that point I'll kind of like figure out a story for them. But I mostly like character based first.
That's cool.
And then Megan.
So this is really random, but I've had multiple story ideas come from Taylor Swift lyrics,
Really?
which is really random because like I like Taylor Swift, but I don't like love Taylor Swift. But the most recent story idea I had came like 2 days after I did my existential crisis video like a month ago, where I was like, maybe I'm just never gonna have another story idea. And then I was listening to a playlist that Spotify had made for me, and it played Look What You Made Me Do. And there was the line where she says, honey, I rose up from the dead. I do it all the time. And like instantly this character came into my head that was like, you can't kill her, and she's being used as a weapon to like go in. People think they've killed her, and then she kills them. And like from there, the entire like first 5,000s of the story just like came really fully fleshed out. Probably because in part I had been trying to come up with story ideas leading up to that point, but that was like the thing that was like, this is where I'm gonna go.
Nice. Yeah, I've definitely had the dream thing. And the last book I finished was not that one. 2 books ago, I think, was one that I like had this like random dream and it turned into a story. But a lot of my stuff is either like an idea for a type of fantasy world I'm interested in, or like a character that's inspired from something else. So one that's like really kind of typical of how ideas tend to come for me is the first book that I wrote from start to finish came from, I was watching, I think it's the second Thor movie, The Dark World. And there's the scene towards the beginning where Thor goes down into like the dungeons and Loki is in his prison cell, and he's just like lounging in his cell and like looks totally fine, doesn't look like a prisoner at all, and he's like cocky and stuff. And like I had this like thought pop into my head of like it was a jail cell meant for a prince, and I was like, oh, that'd be such a cool first line. And so like over like probably like the next year after that, the story built from there of like me figuring out like, who is this prince? Why is he in a jail cell? Like, is he actually a bad person or a good person? And like, what like is his personality like? And so he wasn't really based on Loki at all, and his personality was really different, but it was just like that image of like a prince just like lounging in his jail cell is where it all started from. So
I know people hate Thor Dark World, but like I honestly really like it. And
I enjoyed it.
Like, I was the worst. I was like, it's so good.
Have you seen the analysis of the scene where they go in later and Loki's looking very disheveled in that cell?
Yes.
He's got blood on his feet, but there's like all these like cranberries and stuff like in the corner of the shot. So it's like Loki makes you think he's a wreck, but he has totally played you again while being a wreck.
that is amazing.
Those are some of my favorite scenes, just because there's so much at work there. Even if you're like, oh, like he really did change, like there's always something else in the back, and I'm like, I love that.
I've talked about the Thor movies for a long time. So many emotions about them.
Such a good character.
Yeah.
Great character.
Welcome to our Thor chat.
Loki fan chat. So good. So like once you have an idea for something and you know that it's a book that you want to write, how much planning and developing do you do before you start actually writing the book?
Never enough.
Yeah.
I frequently fall into the trap of like, okay, I really want to plot this, and then I get bored of plotting it, and then I start writing it, and then I get stuck because I don't know where it's going. And that has happened to me probably a dozen times. It's part of my process.
That's why I changed my process actually, is because I would do the exact same thing. So I now am an obsessive plotter, and I actually write out what amounts to a whole synopsis, like very detailed chapter by chapter, because otherwise, I end up with writer's block.
Yeah, I tend to name my characters first because then once I know their names, and I have to know how many characters and what their names are, and then once I can get that, that's usually what starts me off.
Mm.
It's like I've never been able to just be like, oh man, like I really just like I should have put another character, and like I also just write a whole new character. Like no, I need to start like with my core cast and then like figure stuff out later.
Yeah, I tend to err kind of on the side of plotting, but I don't like to do the full synopsis because I am the kind of person where if I've written it out, I'm like, I'm going to stick to that. And I can't change it. And so I typically like to come up with a general ending point, how many main characters there are going to be, and then like a goal and a fear for each of those main characters. And usually as I'm figuring that out, I'll have like flashes of different plot points. And so I'll write those down. I think I talked about this on Thursday. I'll like write them down on note cards. And then before I start writing, I'll see if I can organize anything that I do already have into a semi-plot shaped thing. And then I get started.
Yeah, I'll like put certain like I won't plot it completely start to finish, but I will like put certain points I want to hit like along the story. Yeah, because sometimes characters will just like get away from you.
Yeah, I always have to at least have like the general plot structure. So like I've talked about it a lot, but I use four-part story structure, and so I have to know like the major plot points within that structure, and then I can kind of like, and then I have to figure out like the first like 10 to 20% of it, and then I can get started. But I'm kind of like Kelly, where I just consider starting and stopping a part of my process at this point. Because like I do a lot of plotting and I think I'm ready, and then I start and I like write the first scene, and then I realize it's not right, and I'll rewrite the first scene like three or four times while like figuring out my plot, because I think it helps me figure out like the voice and the character and the world a little bit better, so I can shape the plot better. But I usually write like a good like 15-20% of the book, and then realize that like I don't have the plot right and have to figure it out again.
Yeah. So how do you guys tell? Sorry, I'm eating dinner while we are live.
I was going to say, how's your lasagna?
Great, thanks for asking. But how do you guys tell whether you're in the plotting or like starting the drafting if you are going in the wrong direction? Slash, what do you do then?
Good question.
I see like when I can no longer see where the end point is, that's when I'm like, I need to sit down and like figure out what's going on.
It's funny because I haven't had that yet with the new way I outline, because I am like a shiny, like I like shiny objects like a magpie, and I steal them from different places. And it's the same with like my plotting. So I will actually pick a book that I feel like the tone and pace are similar to what I want to achieve. And then I will go over the story beats and do similar story beats. And I've only done that twice, so I can't be like, I have never had that fail me before, but like the 2 times I tried it worked out really well. And then before I started doing that, I did have times where I would like plot out the whole thing, and I don't figure out I'm doing it, like it's not working until I start writing, and then the story's not doing what I want it to. And then often I would have to start over.
This actually isn't a problem I have very often, if ever, which it's strange because I hear about people having these problems and the character and the story isn't doing what you want. But no, like and it ends up being, I never end up going back and redoing stuff, but it takes me a really long time to figure out. I spend too much time reworking things moving forward. So everything stays from what I've done, but I need to find a way to rework my path going forward. So I'm kind of like, okay, the characters are stuck in this situation. They don't get to redo all their past mistakes. How can I make it interesting to still end the book? Which I don't think is the smart way to do it, but I never seem to wrap my head around, well, I should go back and fix all of the stuff in the past. I'm like, nope, we're going to completely fix the rest of it instead.
Yeah, I've tried that and it has not worked for me.
That is actually one of the finish what you're saying. Sorry.
I would say, yeah, I'm very much like, and it's pretty reliably like within the first like 20% of the book that I will reach a point where I realize that like I'm basically like writing, I'm reaching a point where I'm like writing nonsense just to try and keep going. And like the things my characters are doing aren't pushing anything forward. And it's usually because something earlier in the book like wasn't set up correctly. And like some part of like the like foundation of the story isn't right. And so I have to go back and redo a lot of it.
I actually am the same as Emma, and I have a full manuscript that I wrote, and it was nano at the time. And I was the same, essentially writing whatever just to get to the end of nano and get my word count, and it is sitting on my desktop, and I don't honestly know if I will ever revisit it because it is such a mess, because I didn't realize until about halfway through the book, okay, this is not going at all in the direction I wanted to. And I thought, well, you know what, I don't want to go back, so I'm just gonna push through and take it in a new direction. And it actually ended up being a horrible mess. So I don't even know if it can be I don't know if it could be saved. So I think like if I ever had that in the future again, I would stop and like don't be in a hurry to just keep going with it, because that didn't work for me.
Yeah, my current book, I was writing it during either Nano or one of the Camp Nanos, and I think it was Camp Nano last year, and like I was reaching this point where I was just trying to force myself further and further into it, and like the characters had stopped making sense. Like I felt like they were just doing things, and finally I had to make myself stop, because I was like, I have to keep writing to get my word count, and I was like, no, I need to stop and figure this out because I'm wasting my time.
Exactly. And I think that's a great and horrible thing about nano sometimes, because it could, if everything is flowing and your plot is working, nano can be amazing. But if you have a tough time, you're running into roadblocks, your plot isn't working, I think nano can have the effect of making you try to force your way through it instead of like sitting back and be like, okay, I need to like think about this and maybe have a brainstorm session with a friend and figure out what's not working with your plot instead of just plowing your way forward, So at least in my experience.
Thinking about this, I hadn't realized that maybe the ones where the foundation isn't working are the ones I just abandoned, which I'm okay with. Of like, if enough of the foundation is working that I can't see my way forward, there's probably another idea. And like it's maybe a bit of a privilege at this point of my career thing that I don't feel the same pressure to like finish what I start. I know I can do that. So if an idea isn't working, I can just like let it go and maybe pick bits and pieces from it later. This idea was never going to be a one for me. So
that's one of the things that I have loved about writing a book with another person is that it's very easy to tell like, oh, this isn't working because something needs to be fixed, so we need to stop and figure it out, versus sometimes in my own work I'll reach a point where it's like, this is too hard for me to figure out how to get them out of it, and then I push on and do something easier. But working with a co-author, it's been much easier to be like, oh no, this is just a difficult thing that we now have to find a solution for. Versus
it's so funny that we're talking about this now, because like when I met with Kelly in Toronto, that was what kicked me out of my 9-year-long writer's block, was like talking to someone else and brainstorming. And because I kept running into these walls with this same plot. And I think she made me realize I had been stuck in like a previous draft in my brain, and I'm like, and she'd be like, oh, why does she have to have these powers? Why couldn't we transfer these powers to someone else? Because it's not working for the plot. But in my brain, I couldn't see like,
it was like,
no, that's how it is.
That's how it is. It was stuck in my brain, and I needed someone to be like, this isn't working for you, so change it. Someone point out something obvious. It wasn't obvious to me anymore because I've been working on it for so long.
Yeah, a lot of times people say to write with the door closed, but I am actually a huge fan of brainstorming with the doors wide open, all the windows open. Like, I'm not worried about spoiling my friends; they'll be fine.
I think like writing with allowing selective people to have passes into the room.
But
lately, I think writing with the doors closed is not worrying about the general opinion of like everyone in the public. But you definitely should let some people into the process a lot of the time.
And lately I'm feeling a little like jealous of TV writers and video game writers and everyone who gets to write stories collaboratively. Of like you end up with one narrative, and it's a totally different process because it's never one person's story anymore. Like there's one person who gets a writing credit, whatever, in some cases, but there's a whole room of people trying to figure out how to make this awesome. And like that would be so fun. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's not how it works with books.
I would love to. One of my goals is to co-write with someone, because like because I always see Kyra and Megan having so much fun together, and then B, like having just done that brainstorming with Kelly, being like, oh my God, this is so fun. I love bouncing ideas off of people, and getting excited over them together is way more fun than living in your own brain all the time. Like,
Yeah. We had a question about goal setting from Missy Kate. They mentioned sometimes word count goals are evil, LOL, useful but evil. Do you guys think hourly goals are better?
I have to use word count goals. I've tried hourly goals before, but then I'll just sit there for an hour. And then maybe write like 30 words sometimes. Sometimes it's good. But if I have a word count goal, I can stop and then come back later if like something's not working, and I can still meet my goal just later in the day.
I do the same thing. I have a 2,000 word goal every day if I can. Because it just gives me, and I can be like, oh, I got 500 words. That's just like stacking up towards that goal. Yeah, if I did hourly goals, I would just go on Twitter. Probably.
I try to find like a balance somewhere. I don't have like a specific thing that I do as like a daily goal or anything, because I do think that like brainstorming or, doing things other than writing new words also counts.
Still,
and so I don't want to tell myself like, it only counts for the day if you like wrote new words, when I need to be like brainstorming because the plot I had isn't working and I need to figure it out. Like I want to allow myself to take that time to figure out the story and to figure out the characters and stuff without feeling like, but I have to write my 1,000 words or whatever.
Yeah, that's why I like to do weekly goals. Every Wednesday in writing group, we do goal setting. And I like to look at like, okay, well, what do I have to do this week? Is this a week that I really need to just like sit down and brainstorm things and figure things out? And in that case, I would do more of like okay, well, brainstorm and figure out the next 20% of the book or whatever. And otherwise, I like to do like, a 5,000 word weekly word count goal is like a good one for me that like pushes me, but is not totally unreachable based on my current schedule and life and everything. And then I can adjust like daily. Like if I don't have any time to write, I don't feel bad. I still have 6 other days of the week that I could try and hit
a good way of doing it.
Yeah. I have not been good with my bullet journal lately. Like I just don't have my life together right now. But back when I did, what I was doing is I would like have like a monthly word count goal and like a chart to track that. But then like on my daily spreads, I would have like a spot for each day that just said like writing, and I could write down what I did that was writing related. So I'd say like wrote 500 words, or I could put like brainstormed or thought about the plot, so I could make note of what I did each day, but then like keep track of like bigger goals too.
Yeah.
That worked really well.
That's a good idea.
Do you guys use any kind of like reward? I know Megan uses rewards as like candy and stuff sometimes, and I know VE Schwab uses like stars on the days she does well and stuff. Do you guys use a reward system at all or no?
I have Harry Potter stickers that I put in my planner.
That's adorable. I love that idea.
Yeah, I find it rewarding just to have like charts to fill in or like, things to like show progress. But like actual like physical rewards don't work because
same, yeah.
Yeah, if it's like chocolate, I'm just gonna eat it all at once.
Yeah, exactly the same.
Like I'm allowed to do whatever I want. I'm just gonna eat this.
Yeah.
I feel such guilt. Like the Gryffindor in me is like, I have broken an oath that I've
What a Gryffindor. Meanwhile, I'm just like, no one knows I ate the chocolate.
I hate Megan's gold chocolate already.
Because I'm like a Ravenclaw. I'm like, I like the validation of filling in my word count chart. I don't need I'll eat the candy anyway, but just getting the filling in the graph
I'll
makes
eat
me
someone
happy.
else's candy and still have mine.
As a Hufflepuff, I don't think I have enough self-control because it's just like candy, and then I'll eat it, and then I'll be like, no, my candy's
No more candy.
I still have to write.
Like now I can't write because I'm sad that my candy is gone.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, now I have no candy, so I can't write anymore.
What an emotional roller coaster.
Hufflepuffs have it hard.
Yeah. Speaking of emotional roller coasters, we had a question from Natsa Ninja. How do you organize your character arcs?
Mm.
They're a mess.
I don't.
I was gonna say that's cute. You think I organize character. No.
I usually have like different like signposts I know I want to hit. Like, and I have ideas for things. I'm like, oh, you know, I really want like in this one scene for the character to like experience this thing as part of their arc. But I'm not good at like having a well-shaped, consistent character arc in my first draft. I always have to fix that because it's a mess in the first draft.
Well, like I tend to think of when I write, or even when I'm thinking of plot lines, I think in characters and I think in scenes. So usually I'm like, wow, like I had this idea for a scene, you know, between these two characters. So I'll either work backwards from that or work towards that. So if, you know, at the end I decide there's a scene near the end where I want this character to be, you know, helping this other person, I'll think, okay, well, like what can I do to make that more impactful? So it's like, oh, maybe that person is a really terrible person at the beginning, and then like try and like work backwards from that to figure out where they started.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, I think it'd be cool to like have this character betray this person. Okay, well, why would they do that? And you know, like, like circle around it.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I like to do similarly. I like to know where I want my characters to be emotionally once I hit the end of the book, and conversely where they start, and I need where they start to be very different. And then like I mentioned before, as I'm coming up with like a few plot points here and there, a lot of times the scenes that do pop into my head are like, okay, well, this person and this person are going to kiss, and so now I know that I need to have several scenes in which they have romantic tension, and those things kind of come into my head, and then I like sprinkle those throughout. I love these note cards for that reason, because it's very easy to be like, oh, look, these things aren't spread out enough, or oh, look, all of the romantic tension is happening in the middle, and that's not okay. And I'm sure we'll talk about revisions more as well, but a lot of the smoothing of this comes in the revision stage. Like, I feel like my arcs are okay when I first draft, but once you revise, you can really take the opportunity to sit down with each individual character and be like, okay, well, let me mark on my little note cards with a piece of blue sticky, whatever, every time my character makes a little bit of progress. And then I can look at it and be like, oh, look, the blue is not evenly spaced.
I'm the same as Emma. I almost have virtually no character arc in the draft, because usually when I'm drafting, it's all just like this. It's very plot heavy for me. So I'm like, this happens and then this happens. And I know like my main character might have a bit of an arc that I can use to flesh out. But often, and my editors have pointed this out more than once, often my supporting characters have like no arc. Or almost no personality sometimes. And I've had to go back in. And that was one of my major edits for The Strange and Deadly Portraits of Bryony Gray, was like her friend Mira initially had like zero personality. And they're like, my editor was like, she's basically a cardboard cutout that follows Bryony around. So you need to do something like this. So often my character arcs come in much later.
Yeah, I always have a lot of ideas for character arc.
Yeah.
I have ideas for like really big moments, but it's really hard to kind of connect the dots of all of it. And so in between the big moments, my character is just like circling through like the same like 3 emotions over and over. And it's like, oh, big moment. Now we're gonna circle through 3 different emotions for a while. And so,
I find if I don't write
I was just gonna say there's usually like seeds that you can take. That are there, maybe even accidentally sometimes, that you can take and develop into something in the edit. Anyways, what were you saying, Rachel?
Oh, just saying, like, if I don't write consistently, I'll often forget what their arc is, or like what I'm like not like what their arc is, but like what emotions they need to feel at the correct time. So then I'll end up going back and reading my writing and being like, what? Like, why were they angry again? And like, how does this have to do with anything? And so
That's a big thing that I find propels me in a first draft, but is like a big stumbling block in revisions, is that a lot of times when I'm writing a scene, when I'm drafting, I'll give them these really big emotions and big emotional responses, and then it like feels good to write it. It's like, yeah, she's so mad right now. Look at all these quips. And then I get to the revision stage and it's like, someone just knocked over her cup. And she's like, I'm going to cut your head off.
Similar to Megan's index cards, but on a digital computer scale. I've been using a spreadsheet to track my plot with the book I'm writing right now. And my video this week is going to be like showing what that looks like. But one of the columns in my spreadsheet for every scene, there's a column that just says character development. Because I'm just drafting, it's just like super general, and just like any notes I have about like things we learn about characters or like emotions that they show go in that column. And like later in revisions, I'm going to separate it out into like separate characters so I can track their like separate arcs. But like making the index cards, it helps me see like, oh, like I've had this character like experiencing the same like emotion over and over again, or like I haven't talked about this character's relationship with this other person in like 20 scenes. But I've been talking about the relationship with somebody else like constantly, you know, so it helps kind of like even out that pacing a little bit and see what I might need to focus on.
Yeah.
Desiree, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, when I do my character arcs, like I'll like write down like my main characters, because Death Sales, the one that I'm working on right now, is an ensemble cast. So like I've tried really hard with my character arcs, but I'm a discovery writer, so I can't like plan too much or it'll never get done. So I'll just put like, I'll write like their name down, and then their main goal, their biggest strength, their biggest weakness, and their ending goal. So, because goals usually change, and that's like all I write for character arcs, and that's actually been super helpful to like constantly look at it too. I have it printed out, so it helps.
I like to do that, and I always forget.
I like V.E. Schwab's advice of figuring out like what they fear, what they want, and what they're willing to do to get what they want. And I find that's really helpful when I can't like figure out a character. I use that.
Yeah. You mentioned ensemble cast, Desiree, which made me think of the question, like, how do you decide how many characters to even have in your book? How do you decide which characters get to be in your book?
That was like a process for me, like, because originally I was gonna have 6 characters like in the ensemble cast, and then it went to 4, and it's kind of honestly 3. Like when a character, like I could kind of break up her scenes and give them to the other 3, and it wouldn't even matter at that point because it's not like super fleshed out. But I think it just, I don't know, it was how many characters I needed to tell the story. And like I started with too many. Like 6 was too many because it was that's way too much to keep up with. Like 6 arcs, 6 feelings, and different, all those points of view. No, I couldn't do it. So 4 was a good number for me. And I think it just kind of has to go by like the feeling of the story, and like, because you don't want to have like too many characters, because then your character, you might have one that's super interesting, and then if you have a character that's not fleshed out, it'll drag your pacing really bad. So you have to just kind of figure out how to balance it.
Yeah, one of the last books that I read had an ensemble cast of I think 7, and it was way too many.
Yeah,
it was like
And the big struggle is I always want to write an ensemble cast, but I have such a I get attached to all of them, and then I look at them and I'm like, I can't cut any of you, but like half of you are not necessary.
Yeah, well, it's also deciding like if you want to make an ensemble cast, you have to decide like who, like Desiree said, who is telling the story. Like you can have other people in there, and that's, you know, you can just have them as side characters, but like who are the main people that you need to see, whatever. Because there was characters in this book that I was reading that I'm like, I don't really care about you. Like you're cool and all, but like I don't really need to know your backstory. And then other people that I'm like, I need to know your backstory, and you're barely on the page. So it's like, it's a bit of a balancing act. But like who needs to be important is like the main thing. I've cut so many characters that way.
Yeah. Another big thing is like with Witches of Ash and Ruin is an ensemble cast, and figuring out who sounds like what is also really challenging. Luckily it's not first person, because that would be ridiculously hard. But even so, one of my edits back was like differentiate the voices even more, so it becomes immediately obvious who is telling us the story. And even though there was like 2 that I was like, oh, I'm giving them equal time, it's like, no, I realized later there's one that is mainly driving the story and mainly the main character, essentially. In spite of having like 4 POVs. My
current book, I originally thought that I was going to have like a whole bunch of varied POVs. And like it's ended up being like 2 main POVs with like one being more of the driving force of the story, and then like occasional scenes from other characters' points of view. Because like I realized I could not do as much like changing a point of view as I wanted to.
I really love changing POV, and one of the things I really loved playing with was the bad guy's POV, but because he is the bad guy, because he's the bad guy, you see a lot less of him.
Yeah.
So he still has an arc and everything. It's just not as central. But it's good to get behind the scenes and be like, "Oh, what's happening?" And then you know things that the characters don't know, which I love.
Death Sales. So, like, I think I do it very, very sporadically. So far, I only have like 6, I think, like scenes that are from the antagonist point of view, because it's in first person. Ensemble cast that changes. It is a pain to write, but it's really interesting. But like you learn something about the antagonist and like her plan way before the characters figure it out. And so like I like it because like I want people to know, because it makes it super suspenseful, because you see the characters that you're rooting for, you want them to win, make a plan that you absolutely positively know is going to fail.
Yes. I love that. It's like watching a horror movie when the person goes into the room and you know the murderer's in there and you're like screaming at the TV.
Like,
I love that. Don't do it, you fool.
Yeah, like there's a kind of heist in the story. And it's like a really, really big part of the story. It's like their plan for the whole story is pretty much this heist, but the bad guy knows that they're planning it the whole time.
Amazing.
Yes. Yeah, I won't spoil it at all, but I do feel like the final couple of Avengers movies did that really well.
Yeah.
Endgame does that really well.
Really, so that it is like, oh, who cares? But it can also be done in a way that it's like, oh no.
Don't do that.
We had a question from random person. How do you come out of a block?
Talk to someone.
Take a shower. It'll help. It's really weird, but it always helps me.
A lot of times, like stepping back a little bit can help me a lot, because a lot of times it is like that I'm just trying to like push through, or I'm like I've got to figure out a way to make this thing work, and so I'm like forcing myself to try and think of it. When I like step back and like go for a walk or like read a book or do something else, usually like my brain figures it out in the background while I'm not actively thinking about it.
You can do what Dan Brown does and stand on your head. That's legitimately what he does.
Okay.
Noted.
The blood rushing, I guess.
Yeah. That's your brain.
A change of perspective.
Yeah.
I am a big fan of I have a dog, and that dog gets walks every day, and so my husband and I will go out with our dog, and I already know I'm gonna do this, and he's just like, how was your day? And I'm like, okay, I need you to just stand here in silence while I tell you every point of my plot. And because he knows me and knows that this is a normal thing and not me being a bad friend or something, it works really well. Just to be like, I'm gonna say it to you, and like maybe you'll notice something at the end that was awful, but probably not. But me saying everything, boom, 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 usually helps me be like, but wait, what about this thing?
I do the exact same thing. Like we'll be in the car, and I'll start like complaining to my husband about like, oh, I can't figure this thing out in my book, and I'll like get into all this detail, and then suddenly I'll be like, wait, no, never mind, I figured it out. Even as I start talking it through, I figure out like once I can like hear it out loud, I realize what isn't working. Or like the really obvious solution that I didn't think of, like suddenly I figure out once I say it all out loud.
I sometimes do that to Sean, and except that he always tries to fix it, and he always does horrible things, and I'll always be like, no, that's ridiculous, and then get all like insulted.
I'd say the like wrong ideas can help you get to the right one.
That's true.
And
sometimes it does help.
yeah, in the programming world, if you don't have a person to talk through with, there's like, I don't remember what the official silly title is, but it's like rubber duck programming. Yeah, where you'll talk to a duck and just to say it out loud, and because it's a lot of problem solving. So you're talking through the problem and what your solution is and trying to figure out what's not working just by saying it to this duck who basically becomes your best programming friend.
And then your best life friend.
They never give you bad ideas.
I talk out loud all the time to myself. So if I talk to a rubber duck, will I look less or more like an person?
That's why you need to get a cat. They're good listeners.
You have a cat. She doesn't stay still long enough.
Oh.
She's like, "What are you talking about? I'm leaving."
I've had it with garbage.
And she's called Muse.
Yeah,
so
right.
it's ironic.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We had a question immediately after that was, how do you fix a problematic plot? Or when you feel like you're stuck in your plot. And I feel like all of this really applies to that as well. Just like giving yourself time, let yourself talk to a rubber duck.
I'd also say, like, figure out what your villain's doing. Because I find that's a big thing of, like, what are the protagonists doing next? And you're like, oh, I don't know. Like, just did the thing. And it's like, okay, well, what else is, you know, like, what other forces are at work here?
For sure.
If I feel like the plot isn't working, I'll let myself, like, play around with different possibilities. So I'll, like, make, like, a mock, like, really simple outline of, like, okay, so if I change this thing, how would it affect everything else? And sometimes I'll be like, oh, wait, nope, this doesn't work either. I've hit another roadblock. So I'll like try different things, maybe try writing a scene that involves this new idea, and just kind of like explore and try stuff out until I see what works.
Yes, I do love doing that. I have this big whiteboard, and one time, the book that Kyra and I were working on, there was like this big block that we were at, and it was like we could either have the characters go this way or we could have them go this way, and we had no clue which one was the right one. And so it was just like, if character A does this, and that was one side of my whiteboard, and the other side was if character A does this. And I just like bullet pointed it all the way down, like what would happen afterwards? What would they feel emotionally? How would this affect how they're interacting with the villain and each other and everything? Let me see. I know we have a lot of really good questions, so definitely keep those coming. If I've missed your question, please feel free to re-ask it. As long as it's related to writing a book, I'm not ignoring it.
It's like I have more questions, but everyone's asking my questions in the comments already, so I'll just let them do the work.
We had a question from Kayla. How do you deal with underwriting, if any of you underwrite?
I am a severe underwriter. Like, so bad. But I like being an underwriter because I'm a discovery writer and I never plot out anything very far. So underwriting is actually helpful for me because there's all these things in the back of my head that are like little like semantic-y details that like don't need to be told to get the plot out. So I need to get the plot out or it's never going to get done. So underwriting works for me. And then if you're an underwriter, if you go back in revisions, typically underwriters have more dialogue and less description. So look for that, and that should help.
Yeah, definitely. Also keep an eye on your side characters, your subplots. What things have you kind of let fall by the wayside that you need to go back through and put more into your story? I will usually add like a dozen chapters to my book in revisions. And almost all of them are just like beefing up the subplots, having characters actually interact with each other more.
I used to be an underwriter. I am not anymore. Now I write way too much. But back when I would underwrite, I know a big issue I had is that my scenes themselves were like too short and too rushed. So I would just like speed through like really important scenes and moments. It'd be like, and this happens really, really fast, you know, and I wouldn't spend enough time like describing like what the character's feeling, what they're doing, what they're thinking. It was just like dialogue and like basic action. And I was doing that with a lot of my scenes. So kind of elaborating a little bit more helped.
This is jumping back a little bit, but sorry I missed this question earlier when we were discussing it. But Vanessa asked if we could define what a character arc is.
It's your character's journey from point A to point B, which is the beginning and the end. So it's basically like how they change over the course of the story, the way their like goals change, the way their like attitudes towards the world around them change. So it's really just a fancy word for
Their
their
emotional journey.
yeah, their development. Yeah.
And then we had a question from Anya. How do any of you handle consistent world building? Like, the story of my world is huge, but I didn't really realize that until recently, and it changes quite a lot.
I do that a lot.
So a fun trick that I can't remember which author, one of the authors from the CFS, we were talking about this, but a really good way to introduce parts of your world without feeling like an info dump is have your character explain it to someone who's never been there before.
Yeah.
I'd find like points of, for example, you know, like, oh, some history. Maybe it's a holiday, and it's like, hey, this is this cool holiday, like, and then you kind of explain like the backstory of it. Like, go like bit by bit. You don't have to just be like, this is my world, and here's like everything all at once. You can be like, here's some of the food we eat, and then you know, going into town and like, oh hey, here's that store which is important because of this, and I've been going there since I was a child, and like just like break it up. And I found that helps a lot. So even if you're like info dumping for a whole chapter, it feels a lot better because you're just doing it like little bit by little bit. Or add footnotes. That's always fun.
And I'll say with like consistency and changing things, I do that a lot while I'm writing because I realize like some part of the world building doesn't work, or like I just forgot to think about something that I end up needing to know, and it's totally fine. Like, you can go back and change it later. I usually try to make sure that I like mark something like that. Like, I put a comment in my document or something that says like, I just changed this thing about the world building, or I just added this thing. Go back and fix it in the previous stuff, and then I just worry about, unless it's something really major that's really going to affect the story, I'll just go back and fix it later. If I, you know, change it from it's like a culture where they only have one god to now they're polytheistic or something, like I can go back and change references to it later or whatever.
I think keeping a book Bible or a series Bible is a really good idea. So you write down all the little details like that, because if I don't, I will forget things for sure.
I'm also a big fan of making crappy maps in your book Bible. I have some of my really crappy maps here that I can show you guys. I don't think there's any major spoilers on there, but who knows if this book will even come out, so who cares? But just like really garbage maps, just stick figures. I have no artistic talent in that regard. But I find it really makes me think about like, okay, well, now I have this big room, so what is in it? What would my characters see? What does the exterior look like of this big important building? And that automatically, it's like, oh, well, you know, the world, the exterior would probably have some reference to the deity they believe in, or this thing or that thing. And it's really easy to kind of move out from there if you're struggling with coming up with world building for a big sweeping world. And it's also easy to bring it in when you look at the main places your character is hanging out. Like, if you have a lot of details, how can you put all those details in their favorite haunts?
I think we're kind of due for a world building chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a huge thing. Like I've all of my stuff has been contemporary fantasy so far. So it's going to be interesting because my next book about druids, I want to make high fantasy, and I realized, okay, I've never written a high fantasy. That's a lot more work.
It's so much fun though.
It is really fun.
Yes.
Yeah, you can make the world do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So great. They can have whatever like prejudices or lack of prejudices you want. It's amazing.
I'm pretty excited.
I love that if the world isn't doing what I want, I can change the rules so that the world can do what I want.
World.
Yeah. Let's see. Gavin asked if we have ever read a book that has footnotes. Anyone?
Yes, I have.
Books.
The two, Nevernight by Jay Kristoff is a huge one, but also Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons. Those are two fantasies. I mean, I feel like there is more, but they're mostly like higher fantasy books. those are like the two big ones that I did, and I really like them. I think it's a really smart way to, for lack of a better word, info dump, because you can just, it's optional to learn about the story, and it's kind of fun to just have that extra little bit. Like, it could even the footnotes I've read have been from sassy narrators, so it's fun to just have that little extra this is my world, and like, but you wouldn't know that kind of like little like just jokes.
It definitely has to work with the story. It's like you couldn't just do it in any
narrator.
Definitely
in certain types of books.
My favorite one was one that Kyra didn't finish, which she like posted it in writing group and stuff, and it was so sassy and just wonderful. But that book is not out in the world yet.
That was fun.
Time for like one more question, probably. We've been going for about an hour.
Well, we haven't talked very much about like getting through the book, like the finishing parts of a book. So maybe we should touch on that.
That was one of my questions: is how do you figure out that like perfect ending for your book that resolves all the important stuff? I think that can be really hard. Especially when you're early on.
Silence.
I tend to, again, like I said this earlier, I tend to work backwards. So I'll try and like I'll try and find a scene that's near the end and be like, all right, how can I make my initial idea match up with that? I find that helps a little bit, because if I just write, then I'm like, I have no idea what's going on, or like who people are, or like where I want them to be. So endings are always difficult, because like how nice of a bow do you tie up at the end, you know? And that's a whole other thing of how you want to end your book.
I always know like emotionally where I want my characters to be at the end. So like I know like how much damage I want to have given them by then, and like, you know, like how terrible I made stuff for them. And so I kind of have like an idea of like a final image of where I want the character to be at the end. But I have a really hard time figuring out how to resolve a lot of the conflict. That's really hard for me. So once I've resolved the conflict, the last like 2 or 3 like chapters or whatever after that, I love writing, but it's like resolving that conflict that's so hard for me.
I usually almost always have like a big clash between the bad guys at the end. It's always very physical because, well, I write fantasy. So a lot of it gets hammered out like actually in the confrontation, and then it's just a few things wrapping up for the falling action. And then I always almost know every time what I want the very end, like what we close the curtains on, so to speak. So like imagery and a metaphor type of thing that we started out with. So we come full circle, and usually I think of it like, okay, you know, we started with 3 ravens perched on a railing, and we're going to end with the ravens. And so what gets me to this point that I can close with this imagery? And I often find that works to at least brainstorm how to wrap things up.
For me, I like to look at my list of characters, like particularly if it's an ensemble cast, but even if it's not, like my main character, the villain, any important side characters, and I try to figure out what would need to happen to get them all into the same room. Because for it to be like the big ending climax, generally you would want all your major players in one space, and kind of looking at like what are the conflicts that each of them have been dealing with, and how can I make all those conflicts just like crash into each other just explosively.
I think it's really hard to make those like final conflicts and clashes really satisfying, because like without getting into spoilers, I think that was part of the issue with the final season of Game of Thrones, is that like a lot of the like final conflicts that they've been building up to for seasons were like really anticlimactic, and like it was kind of like we've built up these really like bad like villains, but like how do we get rid of them, you know, like now what do we do?
In the same room and not explode the whole world.
And we can't just kill everybody, so what do we do?
Like the dog that it's like a dog that chases its tail, then it catches the tail, and it's like, oh my god.
Oh no.
Yeah, there's like definitely a really big risk in like setting up like an unbeatable antagonist, you know, which I think is a temptation that's always there to have this like really bad antagonist that feels unbeatable, but then how do you beat them in a way that feels earned and realistic? I don't have any answers here. These are things I struggle with.
This is something I've come up against so many times, and something I really like doing is deciding what my antagonist's weakness is, regardless of how big and bad they are, and giving my character that one little key to defeat them. So like, I can't even think of an example, but it could be like a really small little thing that would make them slip up and lose everything. And my character has this ability or something. You know what I mean? Does this make any sense?
Yeah, for sure.
No.
And
Yeah, I know
you
what you
definitely
mean.
have to like establish and develop that weakness early
Yes,
on.
exactly. Yeah. It needs to, I often get to the end before I even think of this and go, oh, I want this to be the antagonist's weakness. I have to backpedal all the way to the start and give my main character this thing to defeat him with. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There's something I was gonna say, but I can't remember what it was. I'm sure it was not good.
Oh,
But I guess like
Brilliant.
yeah.
I guess like to wrap this up, like we'll have to do like a whole separate chat and revisions because we don't have time to get into all of that. But something I wanted to kind of like end on and ask, because I think like as writers, like we're always like, oh, first drafts are garbage, they're terrible. But I think sometimes like when you're like a beginner writer and you haven't read other people's first drafts, it's like hard to believe. You're like, sure, it's bad, but it's not as bad as mine is, you know? So my final question is just how bad are your first drafts? And like, how do you move forward from that? Like, what do you do? Because I think sometimes you're just like, this is such a terrible draft. There's nothing I can do with this. How do you move past that?
I tend to edit a little bit as I go, so I can't ever just like go and then stop. Like I'll go back and like kind of just like do a really quick kind of edit, so I'm never starting from exactly square one. Just to kind of like keep things inconsistent.
Yeah, I can help it not be so overwhelming. Too.
Yeah, well, I'm not like going line by line and being like, okay, like what is like make sure the scene is perfect before moving on. I'm just kind of like quickly going over it and being like, okay, this thing could change and we'll just all right, great, moving on, and I'll fix that later.
Yeah. Kelly had a really good video in the past on how like your first draft doesn't have to be garbage, and I do feel like it's different for every book. Some of my books have been just like total dumpster fires, and then there are some that I finished and I was like, that's not terrible. Like, I have stuff I need to fix, but like nothing major. And then I've had other books where I had to trash the entire draft, and a lot of it is just give yourself some space and then go back and read it, and you can decide from there. But the space is very important for me.
Very important. Yeah, I was gonna say most of my drafts they're not like a hot garbage pile, but I have had ones where I will go after giving it that space, like the one I was talking about that I wrote during Nano. I gave it that space, came back and went, oh yeah, still a hot pile of garbage. I was correct in that assessment. And so it's on my desktop. I don't know if I'll ever touch it again. If I did, it might need to be entirely rewritten. But like my other ones are the prose at this point in my writing is not bad. But often it's more subtle things like pacing. And it's something that I can almost never fix myself. So technically I could just like write off a draft and send it to beta readers, because usually at that point, I don't do that. I try to make it as polished as possible. But usually at the point now where I am, when I finish a first draft, it's just stuff that I couldn't catch along the way, like character development and pacing, like my main weaknesses. And I don't realize how bad it is until I realize, oh, I need 1 round with my beta readers, 2 rounds maybe, 3 rounds with the editor, and then it becomes like almost like Witches of Ash and Ruin is almost a completely different book. Like it's crazy how much it has changed since you guys read it. It's very different. It's a very different draft. It is not necessarily that the first one was a hot garbage pile, but it just needed a fair amount of work, Yeah,
I definitely think my first drafts have gotten better with more practice. So if you're like, oh, it's so terrible, it's okay to say, you know what, this book was practice. Like it's okay to say like this is really bad and it was just a practice round. Now I'm going to write another book. But I also do feel like when I take that space, like, and I take like a few weeks or however long I need before going back for revisions, when I go back and reread it, I realize it's not as much of a garbage pile as I thought it was. And I'm like, okay, there are actually some good things in this because I need that space because I'm just like so fed up with it by the time I get to the end.
Mhm.
But I find the major issues I have are just like a lot of inconsistencies and like wonky like character development and art stuff. But I feel like my plot is usually pretty like solid, like the like arc of the plot is pretty good, but definitely a lot of like inconsistencies and pacing issues. So
Yeah.
I'm the opposite. Like my character arcs are okay, but my plot is a mess. I'm gonna get, so I know we missed some questions, and because of time constraints, we just aren't gonna be able to get to every little thing. So I am currently compiling some live chats that we've done on some of these topics more in depth, plotting, revising, and I'm gonna put those in the discussion section in the next minute and a half. So if you feel like your questions weren't answered in this one and you'd like to check out more, hopefully those will be helpful to you. So I'm gonna get those together now.
all right. So
I like the idea of doing another world building chat at some point.
And it had an editing one too.
Yeah, that's something I'd love to do. All right. Well, while Megan puts those together, I guess we are going to sign off. We will be back next Sunday. We're doing a write-in next week.
We are.
Yeah, so
Yay.
write-in next week at 7:30, and we will have videos up on Tuesday and Thursday. And we will see you guys later. Bye.
Bye.